Hello and welcome to another paleontology and paleobotany lecture at Utah State University. This is lecture 33 and we'll ask the question, how good is the fossil record of cycads and when were they most dominant? Now before we begin looking at the fossil record, you may not be necessarily familiar with what a cycad is or how diverse they are today. So what I thought I'd do is go through the modern genera of cycads and talk a little bit about each one and then sum up their geographic distribution across the earth today. And then second, I'll briefly outline some of the common fossil cycads and then go into a little detail about cycad reproduction, which will have some bearing on understanding the geographic distribution of cycads today and in the fossil record. This is Stangeria, which is a native living cycad found in Africa today. It has a very limited distribution in South Africa. It's an interesting broadleaf cycad with these fern-like leaves. They're pinnately veined leaves, and they provide a fairly thick cuticle leaf surface. And these leaves can get really big. They can get over 1 meter in length, and they can grow in some of these drought-prone areas too in South Africa. But today they're highly endangered, and like many other cycads, one of the interesting things about them is that their roots encrust around cyanobacteria. So they incorporate cyanobacteria into the roots, and this provides a source for nitrogen. This nitrogen fixation is different than what we'll see in legumes and other angiosperms later on this semester. But the cycads were one of the first plants to start to use nitrogen fixating bacteria. Now plants of Stangeria are either male or they're female, and they grow cones once they reach a certain size. Now beetles have been implicated as the possible carrier of pollen from the male to female cones, and cycads appear to be one of the first groups of plants that may have involved insects in the pollination process. This is Microcycas, which is a critically endangered plant native to Cuba, and there's only about 1,000 plants that are known. Now Microcycas is more of a palm-like tree with this really tall trunk. It has these very stiff fronds of leaves. There's both male and female plants that are present, and with pollination occurring between them. Now, some believe that the reason that these are so endangered is that the pollinator insect that may have pollinated them is extinct. Now, botanists have had a tough time basically breeding these plants in the wild, and they haven't been able to observe any insect pollination. It's believed that these plants were pollinated by weevils, these small beetles, which may have been eradicated by pesticides and controlled burning on the island. Our next plant is Bowenia, which grows native to Australia. Now, Bowenia has 3 species with a fossil record that goes back into the Eocene. It is a small plant growing in the wet regions of Queensland. It's a broadleaf cycad, kind of similar to Stangeria, which does not look much like other cycads. The cones are found really low to the ground, and the plant really does not grow necessarily from a central trunk like we saw in Microcycas. They're very toxic, as with most cycads, and they also have large seeds like other cycads. All right, next we travel to Mexico to see dragon cycads. Now, dragon is a larger cycad with these very cylindrical trunks. There's also male and female plants which have different sizes of cones. They're classified into several different species across Mexico and down into Central America. They're found in really small populations and sort of isolated populations. And there doesn't seem to be much interbreeding between these natural populations. And with this reproductive isolation, there's some room for speciation in this genus. Another cycad from Mexico is Ceratozamia, which is divided into about 30 species living in Mexico and in the southern Central American countries. They live in really lush rainforests of the region, and like other cycads, they also have male and female plants with cones growing out of the center of these sort of cylindrical trunks. Next we have Zamia from Mexico and Cuba, but also ranging all the way down into South America. Now this plant's a little unusual. It's got these really interesting broad leaves arranged in an alternating pattern on the stems. There is over 70 species of Zamia, and they're commonly grown in gardens in warm tropical climates. Now the genus is diverse, and actually there's one species of Zamia that is specialized as an epiphyte. That means that it grows on other plants. The next living cycad is the Australian Lepidozamia, which is the largest of the living cycads, growing up to 15 meters tall with these very broad fronds. Now, the trunks of these cycads are kind of scaly in appearance, and they're thickly barbed. The cones are large. I mean, that's a big cone, but not as large as the African genus Encephalartos. Encephalartos is known from Africa and has the largest cycad cones known. They grow from a round cylindrical trunk with fern-like fronds, and there's also male and female plants. They're distinct, and they reside in small populations in South Africa. And finally we have the genus Cycadius, which is a widespread genus from Asia, Australia to Madagascar, all around the Indian Ocean. Cycadis is placed in its own suborder, represented by over 100 different species. Now when people think of cycads, they typically think of Cycadis, which are also deciduous, and that means there's male and female plants. They're separate. They also have very large seeds that drop from the central stalk of the female plants. Now what's interesting about these cycads is that it takes about 10 years for plants to develop cones and become sexually mature. They can grow in some groves, and they have really some high canopies as well. There are a few other cycads, but this at least gives you a good introduction of the living groups and some of the diversity that we see today. All right, one thing that's striking is their strange geographic distribution. Today's cycads are primarily found in the southern hemisphere, particularly continents like Africa and Australia and Central and South America. Some Cycadis species are found around Southeast Asia, and they're also found in Florida and, of course, the Caribbean. But that's about as far north as they get. They don't get very further north than Florida. Now, although the fossil record shows that during the Cenozoic, when we had much warmer temperatures, they actually did get a little further north, in North America at least, going as far north as Alaska when the climate was much warmer. Now, one explanation for this weird southern distribution is that it's basically a remnant, a vestige of the supercontinent, the super southern continent of Gondwanaland. Now, during the Jurassic, Gondwanaland was beginning to break apart as the continents were breaking apart from the supercontinent Pangaea. Now, at this time, Australia, Africa, South America, and even Antarctica was down here, were all close together. And you can imagine that this is a time in which like cycads are doing really well, and you would have these cycad forests growing on all of these continents and spreading out from this Gondwana supercontinent. And as these continents moved apart, the cycads just basically hung out on these southern continents during the Mesozoic, and just hitching a ride on these continents as they spread out. Now, Laurasia theria, which includes North America, Europe, and Asia, were sort of separated from the southern Gondwana continents, and hence today we don't really have a northern hemisphere distribution or diversity of cycads. Now, cycads were the dominant plant during the Jurassic period, and any dinosaur diorama would not be complete without wonderful cycads tossed in there. So, cycads are regarded as a primitive plant, And they often give us that wonderful feeling of living in an age of dinosaurs when we find them growing today. They're sort of a vestige. They're a remnant of the Jurassic period. And they're often used as a backdrop in old dinosaur movies and in dinosaur dioramas. And, you wouldn't be complete without a nice cycad in a movie about dinosaurs. All right, so let's look at some of the common traits of cycads. So many of the cycads we looked at have these sort of palm-like growth patterns. They have a bulbous or cylindrical trunk, although not all of them. And they grow, and they have sort of persistent armored leaves that grow out of the top, or at least come out. Whether that trunk is sunk into the ground or not just depends on the species or the genus. Now, you also have male and female plants, each with their own particular style of cones, and they produce pollen and seeds. And here in this picture, you can actually see these large seeds that are produced coming out of the trunk here of a female plant. All right, so now that I've introduced you to modern cycads, let's take a look at the fossil record of cycads. Now, I've already introduced the Pteridospermatophyta, or the seed ferns, which includes this particular interesting fossil from the Mississippian, the lower Carboniferous, to the Permian. This is Medullosa, which, remember, was a true gymnosperm, and it had cones. And as fossilized, here is an example of a seed. Now, these plants had these fern-like fronds with some resemblance to modern cycads that we just looked at. So the Medullosales belonging to these guys might have been sort of the ancestors to the cycads that we'll see as we venture into the late Paleozoic. After the warm, wet world of the Carboniferous, the world became drier, and as such, primitive cycads actually had the advantage. So this is Glenopteris. Now, Glenopteris is from the Permian of Kansas, and it's a really weird plant. The pinnate leaves are pachymorphous. That means that this was actually a succulent plant. So a succulent plant is a plant that has very thickened or fleshy stalk to a leaf structure, and this is an adaptation to a very dry climate. So Glenopteris is one of the oldest sort of desert-adapted plants that we know of. But here's what's also really weird about Glenopteris. It's found in very saline limestones in Kansas, and these are interpreted as sort of evaporative seas that were here at present North America during the Permian. And this plant was adapted to living in these very hot, dry, very salty conditions here in North America. So it's a really unusual and strange fossil plant. Now, the Permian in general is a great time for cycads. This is Cteniopteris. It's a form genus for a various morphology of leaves that appear to belong to cycads. Although some people have argued that these form taxa may have belonged to another group called the Bennettillales, which resemble cycads. They can be sometimes included in cycads, but they're slightly different. That group has a fossil record that goes up into the Oligocene, but they're an extinct group of cycad relatives, and it depends on who you talk to of where they are in terms of relationship to other cycads. But this is a form taxa with kind of a bulbous leaf pattern here with a single vein going through and then transpiring veins coming out. So they're interesting form taxa, and we think that they're probably related to cycads, but not quite sure. Next we have Spermopteris. This is another Permian cycad fossil. It's also found in Kansas. And they may be related to cycads, but these are all infertile leaves, and they're the only portion of the plant that goes by this name. There are other fertile leaves that have megasporangium. They're thought to be very primitive, that go under a different form genus, and really this plant's really interesting because we're looking at it. It may be related to cycads, but we need more complete specimens to determine if these really are cycads or if they might belong to one of these other primitive groups. Now, as we venture into the Mesozoic and the Triassic, and actually throughout the Mesozoic, we have a very common fossil. This is Nilssonia. Now, Nilssonia is a form taxa for these very cycad-looking leaves. So, although some of these might belong to other groups, Nilssonia is often the name used for any sort of cycad-looking leaves with these lanceolate leaves. And they have a central stem. This is called the rhicus. And then they have these pinnate leaves, the sort of feather-like leaves that come out from the rhicus. They have very simple veins in the pinnae, the thin leaves. And Nilssonia has been found all the way up in Alaska during the Cretaceous. So it was a cycad or cycad-like plant that has a very wide distribution. Another extreme polar cycad is the Triassic Antarctic Cycadus, found in Antarctica. Now, Antarctica Cycadus is a fossil cycad that really shows how geographically widespread cycads were during the Mesozoic. In many ways, the reconstruction of Antarctic Cycadus resembles many of the modern cycads, at least in form. Now, in China, the Triassic fossil Lepidozamia is this weird, tall, palm-like cycad that grew on a narrow trunk with closely packed pinnate leaves. Now, these fossils are fairly common in the late Triassic of China. Now, not all fossil cycads are leaf taxa. Some, like Anthrostrombolus, is named for the male cones of the plant. So this genus is found in the Jurassic, and it really bears a strong resemblance down here to the modern male cones that we see in Cycadus. So this is just a form taxa for these Jurassic male cones that are found in the fossil record. And finally, there is Ctenis. This is a leaf taxa with wider pinnate leaves that alternate on the rhicus, the stem. They're somewhat oblong in shape here, and they're known from the Jurassic and Cretaceous here in western North America. Now, one of the most remarkable sites for fossil cycads here in the United States was the Fossil Cycad National Monument in South Dakota. The site was a remarkable collection of cycad petrified wood that was preserved in the Cretaceous Dakota sandstone. The site was preserved by paleobotanist George Weirland, who donated the land to the National Park Service in the 1920s. Now, President Harding made it into a national monument in 1922, much like President Wilson had designated Dinosaur National Monument 7 years before. However, the fate of Fossil Cycad National Monument is sort of a sad tale of mismanagement and looting. Without funds to provide a staff for the monument, visitors to the monument began to strip the land clean of the cycad petrified forest that made it such a unique and special place. And by 1957, there were no more fossils within the boundaries of the National Monument. All of them had been stolen. Now, the original collection made by Wieland still resides in the Peabody Museum in Connecticut. However, the monument itself contains no fossils today. All the exposed fossil wood was removed by visitors to the monument. The National Monument status of the park was abandoned, and the land has been turned over to the BLM. Now, the reason that visitors were taking home fossil cycad wood is that it often becomes agatized with silica, such that it forms these really pretty patterns and interesting crystal structures that make them very collectible to rockhounds. All right, let's look briefly at the reproduction of cycads. So here we have a female plant, and these female plants have these large female cones. These are called the strombula, or strombulus is the singular, which basically stick out of the central top of the plant. Now down here at the base we would have the ovea, where the egg resides. Here we have the male reproductive cone, also called a strombulus, and this produces the pollen. The pollen, remember, is the male gametophyte generation. Now the male cone is very tall and broad, and it has hundreds of these pollen sacs spreading down the shaft. Now inside each of these pollen sacs are the sporangia. These produce the spores that grow into the pollen grains. Now hundreds are produced in each pollen sac, and there can be hundreds of sacs on a typical male cone, so lots and lots of pollen are produced. Now the pollen of Cycadus here, that we have some images of, is monotrial. That means that it has a single groove within the pollen grain. Now this is somewhat different than the early pollen that we saw in some of those primitive seed ferns. Also notice that this pollen differs and it lacks the adaptations we saw in conifer pollen, which have those ore bladders that actually increase the blowing distance. This pollen is also relatively large, which may explain why cycads have to use some beetles to help pollinate some cycads, rather than just using a strict wind pollination like we see with other gymnosperms. Now once the ovia on the female plants are fertilized with pollen, the plant will produce really large seeds. Now these seeds will grow and develop from the center of the plant, and once mature they'll basically drop off the stalk as they grow out. Now note that these large seeds down here are not likely to fall very far from the plant. They lack a fleshy fruit, and few animals eat these seeds, as they tend to be highly toxic. Now I've heard some rodents and some bats will eat some of the seeds when they can't find other food sources, especially on certain islands where there's limited food supply. Now this means that the seeds are likely not to travel very far from the mother plant. So geographic dispersal is extremely slow for cycads, with each generation expanding the population a few feet at a time. Now if they approach an ocean, the seeds can float and they can reach other islands, but it takes time. It takes a lot of time for cycads to expand their ranges. Now in addition to sexual reproduction, cycads can also bud asexually from the stem of the trunks. Now these little buds down here can actually grow into later into large adult plants as well. So both modern and fossil cycads are a really interesting group of gymnosperm plants. They were the most dominant during that important period of Earth's history from the Permian throughout the age of the dinosaurs in the Mesozoic. Fossil cycads provide a window into the prehistoric world, and modern cycads provide us a glimpse of this vanished world of cycads living today. Thanks for watching this lecture video. If you'd like to learn more about geology courses offered at Utah State University, check out our webpage at geology.usu.edu. And if you're interested in my research, check out my webpage at benjamin-berger.org. Thanks again for watching.